Disneyland has built some of the most legendary mountains in theme park history. But did you know there was one mountain that they tore down? And this wasn't just any mountain. It was a towering icon, a storytelling masterpiece, and a crucial part of Disneyland's design. And yet nearly after 40 years, it was left to rot, abandoned, and eventually destroyed. But there's an interesting twist to this story because its legacy still does exist, and it's hidden in plain sight. And the reason why it was removed? It's a warning Disneyland's new president needs to hear. For decades, Disneyland had a mountain that towered over Frontierland. So massive that when you were on the Mark Twain or the sailing ship Columbia, it felt like you were completely transported to another world. This mountain was Cascade Peak, Disneyland's lost mountain. Cascade Peak stood 75 feet tall, which may not sound that massive compared to today's theme park icons, but let's put it back in the context of 1960. Sleeping Beauty Castle is only 77 feet tall. The Swiss Family Treehouse, just 70 feet. And at the time, Cascade Peak was billed as Disneyland's second tallest mountain, only standing in the shadow of the Matterhorn. But what really made it feel gigantic was Disney's clever use of scale. Tricked your eyes into believing the peak was even taller than it really was. Because friends, Cascade Peak wasn't just scenery, it completed the story. This mountain made the rivers of America feel limitless, like you were truly exploring the American frontier. It was an anchor to the adventure. Without Cascade Peak, by the time guests reach this part of the ride, most are just waiting to get back to the dock. If the mountain was still here, the story wouldn't feel like it ends early. Disneyland is built on the idea that it's a place where you step into a story, but when something as big as Cascade Peak is erased, that story loses a major chapter. Cascade Peak didn't just disappear, it was slowly erased by a mistake so small, so avoidable, that it should serve as a warning for Disneyland's new leadership and new president, who I'm going to nickname lovingly Tommy Mastasmic. Forced perspective is one of Disneyland's greatest storytelling tricks, and one that fans absolutely love to talk about. But here's the problem. Forced perspective isn't a one and done trick. It only works as long as the elements surrounding it are carefully maintained. And that's where things, sadly, went wrong for Cascade Peak. When it debuted, Disney designed Cascade Peak with careful visual tricks to make it feel enormous. The trees at its base were intentionally small, creating the illusion that the peak stretched even higher into the sky. And in the 1960s, it truly felt like a mountain. But nature kept growing and management stopped paying attention. Every year, the trees surrounding Cascade Peak got a little bit bigger, but the mountain, it stayed the same size. And as the trees slowly started to swallow it, that once glorious peak that anchored Frontierland started to shrink right before guests' eyes. Till sadly, in the 1990s, what was once a mountain just became a giant rock. But friends, this is the frustrating part. This could have been prevented with something as simple as tree trimming. Disneyland has an army of horticulturalists who are some of the best in the world and some of the best and friendliest landscapers on staff. The solution was right there at their fingertips. And I'm sure these people would have loved to do the work. They do it better than anybody. But management didn't want to put the hours or the budget in. So instead of taking care of what once stood as Disneyland's second tallest mountain, it was neglected until it was barely worth saving at all. And this shows the true power of forced perspective. It's not just about making things look big, it's about maintaining the illusion. And when you let one part of the equation slip, the entire effect will collapse. Which brings us to Disneyland's new perspective. Disneyland just got a new theme park president. Tommy jumps in to steer Disneyland on a time when the company is hyper-focused on expansion. New lands, new attractions, new revenue streams. But forced perspective teaches us a major Disneyland lesson. Bigger isn't always better. Because if you don't take care of the foundation, the history, the beauty, the things that made Disneyland so special, then the new additions will only highlight not what's new, but what's missing. And don't get me wrong, growth is exciting. It's a big part of my channel. And change is definitely necessary. But Disneyland is a story, not just a business. And just like Cascade Peak, if you stop paying attention to the details that hold everything together, the magic starts to disappear. You see, Disneyland doesn't just need new mountains. It needs to take care of the ones it already has. Before Cascade Peak became an icon, or before it slowly disappeared, we have to rewind to its beginning. And here's the part that might surprise you. Because from a distance, it looked like a towering structure of natural wonder. But under the surface, it was anything but that. When Cascade Peak was completed, it felt like a massive natural wonder, a towering, rugged mountain shaping the rivers of America. But if you caught a glimpse of it during construction, you'd see the real secret. This wasn't a mountain, this was straight up a Walt Disney magic trick. The same team that had just finished the Matterhorn was tasked with bringing Cascade Peak to life. But while the Matterhorn was a fully built out attraction, complete with bobsled, roller coaster running through its icy caverns, Cascade Peak, it was different. It wasn't an attraction, it was a set piece. And therefore, got a way different budget. So what was inside of the mountain? Well, it was absolutely hollow. Nothing but a skeletal frame of steel beams and wooden supports. Workers could actually climb a ladder inside to the peak and step out onto the very top. One of the rarest views in Disneyland's history. Cascade Peak's real spectacle was its waterfalls, which weren't just for show. Powered by 3 massive pumps, they forced 91 tons of water per minute up a central standpipe that would then spill down the rocky facade. It was a massive operation designed for visual storytelling and another little secret with the river we'll get to later. But unlike the mighty Matterhorn, Cascade Peak wasn't built for longevity. It wasn't designed to be ridden, walked through, or explored. Because of that, it likely didn't get the same attention to detail in its original construction. And that's where the irony lies. When you see Cascade Peak from a distance, it feels simply impossibly massive. But when you see it being built, you realize just how small and fragile it actually was. But because Disneyland isn't just about what's real, it's about what feels real. And Cascade Peak was one of the greatest examples of that magic. There's a reason vintage Disneyland felt so alive. Every corner of the park had movement, sound, energy, working together to create an environment that wasn't just something you saw, it was something you felt. And nothing embodied that more than Cascade Peak and its purpose that it was designed to serve. The best way to experience it was from the mine train through nature's wonderland. As you rode across a wooden trestle bridge with no rails and no barriers, the waterfall rushed to your right, ran underneath your train, and then spilled into the rivers of America on your left. By no means was it a thrill ride, but it felt thrilling. Not because of what the ride did, but because of everything that was happening all around you. That was the genius of kinetic energy in early Disneyland design, something that sadly it seems they've gotten away from. But it wasn't just the water that gave life to it, it was the movement. Cascade Peak was part of nature's wonderland, a massive world filled with 204 animated animals, birds, and reptiles, all carefully placed to create the illusion of a thriving frontier wilderness. And if you looked closely, one lone mountain goat stood at its highest ridge, watching over the land. Today, this kind of kinetic energy is something many fans feel is missing from Disneyland's modern lands. Take Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, for example, panned by critics for having no kinetic energy. The original Disneyland had to be bold and loud in its design because it was built on a budget. Every piece had to pull its own weight to make the park feel much larger than what it really was. And as a result, a great side effect from that, Disneyland felt like it was constantly hugging you from every direction. You see, the early Imagineers and designers of Disneyland knew something very, very important that seems to have been lost in time. Kinetic energy is the park's voice. The water crashing, the train chugging, the boats drifting, it all worked together to let you know that Disneyland was truly alive. But when pieces like Cascade Peak disappear, the voice, sadly, gets a little quieter. Like a song missing its melody, the silence is what people notice the most. And now it's up to Disneyland's new president to bring that voice back, to make sure that in every new project, Disneyland doesn't just grow, it moves, it breathes, and it lives again. Because a lot of folks feel like the magic has slowly been slipping away over the first half of this decade. Okay, before we move forward, let's take a quick step back in our story and answer the big questions. When did Cascade Peak appear? Why was it built? And how long did it last? Cascade Peak officially premiered on May 28, 1960, as part of the mine train through nature's wonderland. It was Disneyland's 45th attraction and a key part of the largest expansion in the park's early years. The entire project was inspired by Walt Disney's True Life Adventures documentary series, and was designed by Imagineer Bill Martin. In total, it cost $1.8 million, a major investment at the time, but was quickly built in 18 months. The mine train through nature's wonderland would run for 17 years, officially closing January 2nd, 1977, to make way for Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. But Cascade Peak itself survived for 2 more decades. I've always seen Cascade Peak in old footage of Disneyland and thought, that looks incredible. It's one of those icons that feels like it should still be here today. So why exactly did it have to go away? And more importantly, could something like that happen again? Well, I'll tell you, and I hope not. And really, that's the real question here, because on this channel, as you know, we don't just study Disneyland's past for nostalgia, we study Disneyland's past so we can better predict its future. And while we find Disneyland and its changing of the guard, what happened to Cascade Peak is a warning I don't think Disney can afford to ignore. As we all know, everything at Disneyland has to be multi-purpose. Cascade Peak wasn't just a mountain, it was also a storyteller. Carved in its rocky face were 2 waterfalls, each with its own name and its own story to tell. And the one guests encountered first was called Twin Sisters. As you approached, the sound of rushing water filled the air, crashing down right beside you. The idea behind the name, the falls were so loud and so close. It felt like 2 sisters whispering or arguing right as you passed by. It was one of those tiny storytelling details that added personality to the landscape, making the world of Frontierland feel richer and more alive, because it too, like wherever you're from, had its own unique backstory. Now, the second waterfall, that's a whole different story, because that waterfall, it didn't just shape the legend of Cascade Peak, it helped shape the future of Disneyland. And not just here at Disneyland, but Frontierland on 3 different continents. We'll get to that later on in today's story, because this simple waterfall, it had a much bigger impact than anyone could have ever predicted. And you can still hear its echoes today in several Disney theme parks. It also had a much bigger job, because as we learn on this channel, everything in Disneyland is built for a reason. It was designed to serve a critical storytelling purpose inside of the rivers of America. Back in 1960, this area of Frontierland was inspired by Walt Disney's True Life Adventure documentaries, which meant it was portraying different real-world environments from across North America. So the challenge, how do you take guests from one landscape to another without making it feel like an awkward jump? You see, this is where Cascade Peak came in. The mountain stood between Beaver Valley and the open waters of the rivers of America, acting as a natural barrier between the two. It was big enough and detailed enough that as you passed by, your brain would automatically reset. You weren't in Beaver Valley anymore. You were somewhere brand new. And friends, its job didn't stop there. It helped also control the sight lines, blocking guests riding on the Mark Twain, the sailing ship Columbia, and Mike Fink keelboats from seeing Bear Country and other lands too soon. Without Cascade Peak, the whole landscape of Frontierland would have felt flat, like one giant open space, instead of a carefully structured world of chapters and storytelling. And here's something most people don't realize. Those waterfalls, they weren't just for show. They actually helped aerate the water in the rivers of America, keeping the water clearer and healthier for the boats and the animatronic wildlife that once filled nature's wonderland. Cascade Peak wasn't just a mountain. It was a bridge between different stories. It was a tool that helped keep the magic alive and made the moment in front of you the only moment that you thought was real. And yet, I can't help but think it's another reminder that everything in Disneyland, no matter how small, was designed with purpose and intent. If Disneyland's new president wants to honor Walt's vision, he should look beyond aesthetics and focus on curation, because the best design isn't just what guests see, it's what guests feel. Never realizing how carefully they're being guided through the story, Disney has always been a master in hiding operational infrastructure inside of storytelling devices, making the practical feel magical. And here lately, we've seen some of the ugly parts not be hidden, but instead exposed for every guest to see. I would encourage Tommy Tasmic to focus on bringing back Walt's attention to detail. Everybody's missing it, and everybody wants to see it again. We're rooting for you, Tommy.
Hey kids, it's me, Cascade Peak, and I was bigger and better than any popcorn bucket you ever had. But I'm dead now. And you know why? Because Disney thought nobody cared. Show 'em you care. Avenge my death. Subscribe to Hey Bricky, because he's fighting for my memory and not the newest popcorn bucket or brownie. Avenge my death. Subscribe. Gracias.
But by the 1990s, Disneyland was under new leadership. And that leadership had way different priorities. Paul Pressler, AKA Bob Chapek Sr., his era of being the Disneyland president was defined by cost cutting over care and profit, sadly, over preservation. Cascade Peak, like so many other pieces of Walt's Disneyland, were neglected. Routine upkeep was ignored, deemed too expensive. The trees around it grew unchecked, choking out the forced perspective. The waterfalls, once a source of life and movement, were now a source of water damage and structural decay. And it came to a moment where Cascade Peak, sadly, was beyond saving. All the warning signs along the way had been ignored. It could have been repaired, but instead of investing in the park's history, management deemed it expendable. In the fall of 1998, Cascade Peak was demolished. Not because it had to be, but because maintaining it wasn't seen as being worth the cost. So what replaced Disneyland's icon? Sadly, a mound of dirt. That's what they thought would fill the void left behind by a landmark that once defined the rivers of America. And friends, it's a decision that, if you ask me, betrayed everything that Walt Disney and his ideology of theme park design stood for. Because Disneyland isn't just about the new, it's about nurturing what already exists, taking care of the stories, details, and experiences that made this place feel alive, and basically an instant American classic. And to believe this is a great lesson for Disneyland's new president today. Disneyland is a living, breathing thing. If you don't nurture it, it will wither away. And today's audience, they are smarter than ever, and they know when you trade a mountain for a mound of dirt. Let's hope the mistake of Cascade Peak never happens again.
It has been said that Disneyland will never be complete. In fact, I said it. That there will always be something new and unusual. And that's our hope. In Frontierland, even the past has a future.
That is what Walt Disney always believed. And even though Cascade Peak is long gone, its legacy, it still echoes through Disneyland today. Because friends, there's one part of the story that I promised you I'd tell you later. And now is about that time. The second waterfall, the one we didn't name, it was called Big Thunder. And when Imagineer Tony Baxter was designing a new attraction for this corner of Disneyland, he kept that name close. He took inspiration from that rugged rock formation, the crashing waterfalls, and the spirit of adventure that Cascade Peak had brought to Frontierland. And that is how we got Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, the wildest ride in the wilderness. So the next time you're racing through Big Thunder's Red Rock Canyons, just remember, you're riding through a legend, a tribute to Disneyland's Lost Mountain. But it still is here. It's not entirely gone. And if you know where to look, you can still see its foundation. It was behind me the whole time. To me, that's part of the real magic of Disneyland. It's not just about what's new, it's about what came before. Because even when mountains disappear, their echoes truly never fade. First, I want to give a shout out to Kenny P. Rocks. He was such a nice guy and such a great president of Disneyland. But I also want to welcome Tommy Tasmic, Disneyland's new president. And I'm sure I don't have to tell you, Tommy, you're not just taking on a role, you're stepping into a legacy that has been carefully built for 70 years. And we're all rooting for you, because when you succeed, Disneyland succeeds. And if you don't let us down, we won't let you down because we're loyal. We love this place and we just hope that you love it too.